So, first of all, I want to welcome everyone who was able to make it today. We put this together fairly quickly, and we're just delighted to have so many people show up, and many more have registered. And what we know from other webinars is that they will they're looking to view the video, which we'll be sending out to everyone later on. So, my name is Peter Millman, and I'm on the board of People's Actions for Clean Energy, one of the local sponsors of this event, along with our esteemed colleagues at Connecticut Energy Network, especially Patrice Gillespie. We are here to discuss a recent study, Why Local Solar for All Costs Less, a new roadmap for the lowest cost grid, because it has the potential to change the narrative about how we in Connecticut view the ongoing debate about utility scale versus distributed local resources. The study was written by an energy planning group called Vibrant Clean Energy. The three organizations that commissioned the study were Local Solar for All, the Coalition for Community Solar Access, and Vote Solar. We are grateful to each of them for joining us here today. We at PACE became aware of the study months ago, but its significance really came into focus for us when we embarked on our initiative to raise the caps on the development of local solar, particularly for commercial projects. You can learn more about our Coalition for Sensible Solar Regulation later by going to our website, which we'll put in the chat. Our hope is that what you hear today will not
check the soap dish.
No.
Our hope is that what you hear today will not only inform the discussion of caps on local solar and battery storage, but all future planning for our electric sector, which will be expanding because we need to electrify everything from the cars we drive to how we heat our homes. This study suggests that we can't afford to continue thinking about distributed generation as an expensive boutique solution when in fact it is necessary to achieve the lowest cost clean energy grid. The potential savings from properly valuing distributed resources are huge. The basis of the study is a newly developed, more data-rich, granular computer model that is far better able to evaluate the best mix of utility scale and local renewable energy resources than do current energy planning tools. The results of the modeling were clear. The least cost way to get to a clean energy sector is by adding copious amounts of distributed solar plus batteries to existing and planned utility scale solar, wind, and battery storage. This recipe works for, among other reasons, because it smooths out the demand for electricity by reducing peak demand periods, which are a significant driver of both supply and distribution costs. We have three distinguished speakers with us today. First, Karl Rabago, representing Local Solar for All, will talk about the study's overall methods and conclusions. Then Caitlin Kelly O'Neill from the Coalition for Community Solar Access will discuss the results of running the model specifically for the state of New York, one of three states the study focused on after looking at the continental US as a whole. And finally, Nathan Phelps from Vote Solar will talk about the significance of all this for Connecticut. I want to mention that we will be emailing the slides to everyone a few days from now. As for questions, after each speaker, we will allow just a few clarifying questions and save the main question and answer period for the end during probably what will be the last half hour. Please put your questions into the chat where Bernie Pelletier will collect them. Karl Rabago has 30 years of experience in energy, climate policy, and markets, and is recognized as an innovator in utility regulatory issues relating to clean and distributed energy services and technologies. He is a frequent author on electric industry issues and has provided testimony as an expert witness in more than 100 electric and gas utility regulatory proceedings. He has been a commissioner on the Texas Public Utility Commission, a deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, vice president of distributed energy services at Austin Energy, director of regulatory affairs at the AES Corporation and AES Wind, managing director and principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and energy program manager at the Environmental Defense Fund. In other words, And here I'm going to, I hope that you're old enough to remember this commercial. But in other words, when Karl Rabago speaks or talks, people listen. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Karl.
I'm going to unmute myself, and then I'm going to shift to PowerPoint and see if I can execute a screen share. Let's see. All right, can I get a thumbs up from anyone if you can see the screen that says Why Local Solar? All right, excellent. And you can apparently hear me and maybe even see me over on the side. I'm the least important part of this presentation. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day today and to join us for this conversation. And I hope this will be the most interesting and conversation provoking thing that you do all week and maybe longer. Just a little over 2 years ago, we filed comments at Deep and Pura about the modeling that they would be doing to plan for Connecticut. We told them, and when I say we, I was writing comments on behalf of Save Our Sound and then the Connecticut Fund for the Environment. We filed comments saying better modeling was available and that better computer processing capability was available, and that Connecticut ought to take the opportunity to use that better modeling in order to help map out Connecticut's future. We've moved on since that time and conducted the modeling, and we're going to share some of the results with you today. This is going to be fast because, to be quite honest with you, there's a lot underneath all of this, but there's plenty of time for conversation. And again, please feel free to leave the questions in the chat box so that we can get to them. So without further ado, let's get started on how we can get a roadmap to a least cost electric grid. The first thing we have to do is assess and take appraisal of your mental furniture. Your mental furniture, if you've been paying any attention to energy, especially electricity issues, is generally arranged in a way that assumes that the bigger power plants are the least expensive way to make electricity. And there's a good reason for that, because it's true. The cheapest way to make a kilowatt hour is at a big, efficient power plant. The problem is that that isn't the whole story. The whole story is that that electricity has to get from a power plant to serve a load, to a business, to a home, to some place where the electricity is needed. Unfortunately, the idea that the biggest power plant provides the cheapest kilowatt hour also infiltrates our thinking about how planning should be done. Our planning models assume that since bigger is cheaper, then the bigger power plants and bigger scale renewables is going to be the cheapest, fastest way to get to clean energy goals. All these assumptions, and the final assumption that the little stuff is conversely more expensive, and we can't afford a clean energy future if we use distributed energy resources. All these ideas are pretty firmly fixed in our brain. I want to dislodge, I want to give you an opportunity to rearrange your mental furniture just a little bit and open yourself up to some different thinking. The new thinking that I want you to entertain is that new and better models, better computing power, applying things we've learned many over the decades since we invented computer modeling approaches for the utility system, are showing us that if we can scale our distributed energy resources along with our utility scale resources, that is the pathway to maximizing storage, maximizing ratepayer savings and minimizing the cost of building out the grid. Whatever you have heard about distributed energy resources, about net metering reform, about too much rooftop, about too much distributed solar, needs to be looked at real hard. Now, you know as well as I know that there have been oodles and oodles of studies about how individual applications of distributed energy resources can provide greater value, great value that's even greater than the cost of those resources. But until these computer models, until this Wisdom P model I'm going to tell you about was available to us, we didn't know if you could scale up if you could really use that stuff as a resource, not just treat it like an inconvenience to a utility, not just treat it as a problem that needed to be solved, but actually tap into distributed resources for their ability to give us that pathway to a lower cost grid. Well, now we can learn just how much we can save because those resources are available and they're more economical. And if we use them at scale and as a resource, the future indeed is less expensive. We launched our results with a report in 2020, at the very end of 2020, that told us what would happen if we optimized, if we took advantage of distributed energy resources with a computer model that could dynamically select these resources. And we found that we could save a lot of money. Okay, so I'm gonna nerd out. There's a nerd warning a little bit here. I'm gonna nerd out on you just a little bit, because what I'm gonna be talking about is what we call production cost and capacity expansion modeling. And everybody's done production cost and capacity expansion modeling. That's a joke. I know not everybody has done it, but actually the truth is you actually have done it. You just don't realize what you've done. So I want to introduce you to these concepts because this is how we plan for the utility. And I'm going to tell you about how when we do these modeling capacity expansion and production costs, we can save these big numbers. I want these big numbers on right in front of you while we talk about what's happening. Okay, so production cost. When utilities have to do planning, they model out or the demand for every hour in a year over several years, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, and they select resources for every one of those hours that has the lowest production cost. And then when that resources run out, they go the next least expensive, and the next least expensive until they have the resources needed to meet the demand for electricity during that hour. There are 8,760 hours in a year. You do this for 20, 30, 40 years, you got a lot of hours you got to plan for. Utilities have generally taken chosen resources that are utility scale resources in order to select that. So have you done production cost modeling? Yes, you have. Let's imagine a spaghetti dinner. You suddenly find out that you're going to have friends coming over for dinner and they'd love you to make your homemade spaghetti. How are you going to do it? Well, you'll look at your pantry and you'll check and see if you have enough tomato sauce. Let's make it out of a can because they didn't give you time to really do the full-on fresh tomato approach. You're going to go to the store to get what you need. You're going to see that aisle with tomato sauces and tomatoes, and you are going to go, oh my gosh, I didn't know they made so many of them. These are the resource options. These are the power plant resources that the utility can pick. These are your resources for making your spaghetti sauce. You're going to look at those cans and you're going to look at the quantity and you're going to look at the price. You're going to look at how many of the cans are available on the shelf and whether there's enough there to make your spaghetti. And when you select your cans for that night's dinner, you will have conducted a production cost modeling exercise. Now, capacity expansion is the utility activity of planning for what kind of power plants to add to meet demand over many of those hours. How much capacity do you need to add? And after so many trips to the grocery store to pick up canned tomatoes, there's a good chance, if you're like me, you'll think about homegrown tomatoes. You'll supplement your recipe with things that you make right there in your garden. You'll accumulate them, you'll find a farmer's market, or you'll find a local co-op grocer, or you'll start looking around the places where there are people providing lots of tomatoes that meet the needs that you have for policy and for adequate tomato supply. You will conduct a capacity expansion exercise and figure out how you're going to be able to do that. All right, and how you're going to be able to make a successful spaghetti dinner. So you've done production cost and capacity expansion modeling. If you've ever made a spaghetti dinner, now you have the opportunity to imagine how utility people do it for the grid. When they do it, they're subject to those same limitations of sort of that mental furniture. They've always chosen bigger resources because they assume bigger resources are going to be less expensive. But when you take advantage of the small stuff, and you plan for the lower 48 states, you can save nearly $500 billion just trying to clean up the electricity grid itself. You will create incrementally 2 million more jobs that come as a result of the fact that distributed resources are more labor intense. You will get 223 gigawatts, 223,000 megawatts, 223 million kilowatts of local solar by 2050 across the United States, and much more efficient use of your utility scale resources. That's the opportunity we're talking about with better modeling. And how do we get to do this? Okay, so how did we do it? We said just one simple goal: clean up the electricity grid by 2050 and turn on better modeling. So to know what better modeling is, we got to go back to the old modeling just for a second. Nerd alert too. Our old models were designed for the 19th century electric grid, big power plants feeding down transmission, feeding down distribution, finally coming to our house. Power plants in the gigawatt scale to serve average customer demand at the kilowatt scale. So we're talking about much bigger. It's drinking water from a fire hose and there's a lot of spilling, but it was so cheap that it actually made sense 100 years ago or so. We were safe ignoring everything on the right side of this diagram. And in fact, our computer models couldn't handle it anyway. But the answer was always choose another big resource. The limitations of that produced their own results. And we knew there had to be a better way. We knew from all those value of solar studies, we knew from all those distributed energy resource deployments that there was value there. Again, we wanted to know, could we get it if we did a lot of them? So we tapped into this amazing wisdom model, a utility planning model that does both production cost and capacity expansion modeling in one place, and that breaks down the barrier between utility scale resources and distributed resources. Now, some of you might be asking, what's the difference between utility scale resources and distributed resources? This is a technical number. Distributed is anything smaller than what they call 69 kilovolts. Basically, it's everything at a substation or below. The substation sits on the white line, generally speaking here. And in this model, it specifically does. But we got this new model that had much more computing power, the ability to process 10,000 times more pieces of data than the models utilities use. And so we got a much richer view that not only considers the resources on the left, but also dynamically can select the resources on the right to find the least cost solution, because that's always what you're solving for. At the same time, it can also look smaller. So when you get a conventional utility model like an Aurora model, the smallest increment of resource you can add is 50 or 100 megawatts of power plant. That's many, many times more than you need for your home. With this model, we can model down to 1 kilowatt. With those utility models, you plan, traditional utility models, you plan for 1 hour, 8,760 planning increments per year. With this model, you plan down to 5 minutes, 105,120 increments every year. With the old models, you plan for all of New England or all of Connecticut at the smallest, or all of a utility service territory. With this model, you plan down to 3 square kilometers. When you have this kind of focus, this kind of granularity, this kind of resolution, you can see things, you can see less expensive things. And the wisdom model created by Dr. Christopher Clack and his team at Vibrant Clean Energy enables that resolution. It's like the difference between planning your vacation, looking at a elementary school globe, and pulling up the latest Google Maps software. It's like the difference between Galileo and his simple telescope and that Webb telescope they launched that now enables us to see almost to the back of all the way back to the start of the universe. It is much more powerful resolution for much better solutions. How does the model make things, how does it save money? Well, by taking advantage of distributed resources. These graphs here kind of this actually simplifies the analysis. On the top, we're looking at a modeling where you just look at utility scale resources alone. What you see is that on the right, there's distribution demand that kind of comes out to be that dark black line, and you see it goes up and down. These are for some of the most intense summer hours of the year. Following those changes in demand is expensive. It costs a lot in terms of utility infrastructure, and it means that we wear out our big power plants more. We'd have to have peaker power plants that run very few hours, but still cost a lot. We basically have a utility system chasing changes in demand, and that's an expensive way to do things. When we add distributed resources, both strategically and at the fine scale that this model enables, we smooth that load out. We use right-sized resources to get just what we need when we need them. We toggle between local production and utility scale production, between local storage and utility scale storage, to make for a smooth grid operation cycle. And when you have that kind of smooth load, you lower everybody's cost. But wait, there's more. It also shapes the load. If you look at the top of this graphic, you will see the shape that the utility system operates according to. Along the horizontal here, we have the percentage of the year, hours of the year, if you will, and up going on the vertical, we have the demand. And what you see right away, looking at the top of this graphic, is that we actually use 100% or 90% or even 80% of our grid assets less than 10% of the time. We have an asset utilization problem in the electric grid, meaning that we got a lot of resources. They have to be there, at least under the old design paradigm, to serve just relatively few hours. But we want electricity during those hours. When we take advantage of local solar and storage, we reshape the grid. We shave that light blue off of the utility load shape. We fill in that little dark blue over at the far right corner. We end up getting rid of almost all our peak problem and saving electricity and therefore money over 80% of the operating hours in the year. And when you've got this kind of benefit to the entire grid, that's how you get to $500 billion in savings just in cleaning up your electricity load. That's a solution worth chasing, and hopefully it moves your mental furniture. You can feel it starting to budge. So how does it come out? Well, we did some scenarios, and this is what you do in modeling. You basically put together some scenarios here that we called DER savings, that's optimizing and taking advantage of our distributed resources, versus business as usual. And then we looked at if we had DER savings and we tried to clean up the electric grid, or if we just stuck with our business as usual approach, and then compared DER with savings against business as usual, didn't even try to clean up the grid. These curves show you what happens, right? If you just turn on the DER and clean up the grid, you only save about $100 billion by 2050. But if you actually compare that to trying to say the blue line, try to compare it to get to that clean electricity using a business as usual approach, that's how we get that nearly $500 billion in savings. Let me be very clear. If your policy is clean electricity for your grid, and you don't take advantage of distributed energy resources across the lower 48 and in each state we've studied, you are wasting money. That's the takeaway from turning on these distributed resources, taking advantage of the load smoothing and the load shaping that distributed resources can provide. How does it change things? Well, this is almost an eye chart's worth of things, but it basically shows you that between the business as usual and the DER scenario on the left versus the clean electricity scenarios on the right, distributed energy resources diversify your mix. And just like in ecology, a more diverse electric mix will give you lower costs. Jonathan, I saw you raised your hand. Can we hold it? Because I'm going to wrap up the presentation here and then we'll take some questions, but I promise you we'll get right to you. And it's great to see your name again. So this is installed capacity, a more diverse mix that gives us more resilience, that gives us more advantage, takes more advantage of distributed resources, an energy mix that takes greater advantage of utility resources like wind, solar and wind, but also adds in vital amounts of distributed photovoltaic, as well as some other resources in the mix. What's the big takeaway here? We don't have to change the way the grid works, right? It's mostly on the way. We just have to take advantage of these distributed resources as we move forward. We also did this in a couple of other states. In California, we modeled this and found out, because they were having this big debate about net metering and other things, we thought it was appropriate to run the model there. They were saying, hey, we need to reduce the amount of distributed solar because it costs a fortune. Guess what? Just pursuing the utility scale resources is the more expensive option. California can save $120 billion all by themselves if they take advantage of distributed storage and distributed solar. And if they do that, they actually have to increase the amount of those resources that they're building, and they'll get job benefits for it. We did it in Illinois. They could save $3.5 billion by 2050 if they proceed to take advantage of their distributed resources, more jobs, accelerated reduction in greenhouse gases. We did it in New York, and Caitlin's going to tell you all about that, so I'm not going to steal her sizzle, but they're good numbers too. We then ran the model against President Biden's, or the current conversation in Washington, a 2030 goal of national modeling. We want to know, do we have to wait to 2050 on this, or can we get after these resources now? Just modeling to 2030 in the lower 48, we found that not only do we have to step on the gas for distributed resources, 103 gigawatts of distributed solar, 137 gigawatts of distributed storage, but we can enable, it will also enable, well, all those big numbers, over 500 gigawatts of utility scale solar and 442 gigawatts of wind. This is the jobs program for the United States, 1.2 million local solar and storage jobs by 2030, and a savings of $109 billion in costs just by 2030. And we're learning that if we take advantage of this detailed mapping capability, we can also target our investments for low and moderate income households and neighborhoods. Again, Caitlin's going to tell you about New York, and accomplish some of our justice goals as well. We're not alone. The studies from the Department of Energy, the studies from the Solar Energy Industry Association, our previous studies from Princeton, MIT, all confirm that distributed resources should be a part of the future. This is our 2030 results, same thing. We diversify the top end of the chart. We don't have to rebuild the entire grid, but that added critical element of diversity is what makes the system work. So wrapping up, what do we know? Well, we already knew solar was the most charismatic energy resource.
Oh my gosh, I love watching the nights. So,
oops, somebody mute. We already knew that these were charismatic energy resources, that the people want them and believe they will provide value. We knew they provided value in small scale. Now we know they provide value in big scale as well. That not only should we grow distributed resources, but this will enable us to grow our other resources too. We know that this is not the time to slow down our work on distributed rooftop solar, community solar, local solar, and local storage as well. We need to grow them 2 to 4 times faster than we grew them in the past. And we know that we have opportunities to do more, to focus on justice goals, to provide an insurance policy for the expensive and big project transmission that we need to develop. We know that local resources offer grid resilience and reliability benefits. We can grow more jobs and reach our climate goals faster if we take advantage of these things. I want to end by telling you 3 big things that came into my head because once upon a time, I was a regulator. First, policymakers and everybody in the public, because of that old arrangement of the metal furniture, have been made to think that we have to choose between the big stuff or the small stuff. That's a false choice. What we need is both. We're the and people, and we need to be the and people, not the or people. And this is a comfortable place for regulators and policymakers too. Don't choose one or the other, choose both and get even more benefits than you thought. Second, those savings can be reinvested. $500 billion in the US study by 2050, $1 billion by 2030. By the way, if we electrify the economy, those savings go to $1.5 trillion by 2050 that we could reinvest into, at least partly, into saving people money on their electric bills, into accelerating technologies, into dealing with the legacy of energy injustice. And then finally, let's think about how we've been doing business. We have seen billions, if not trillions of dollars of utility and system planning decisions made on the output of a single model selected and run usually by the proponent of the plan. Hard to get at, hard to participate in. This model enables us to get another perspective. We would never make major utility decisions in any other area based on one model's output. We don't have to make our capacity expansion and production cost planning as modeling with only one model anymore. With that, I hope I've gotten you excited and we can turn over. Well, this is the time when we said we might jump in for any clarifying questions. So I'll maintain control of the screen just in case we have to look back at a slide. But does anybody have any quick clarifying questions before we go to Caitlin?
First of all, Karl, thank you for that spectacular presentation. And although we're going to keep most questions to the end, I'm going to let Jonathan Steinberg, our representative, ask a question because they have representatives have. I'm trying to ask to unmute. Have trouble with timing issues. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you for recognizing that. I am currently using my phone because my other 2 devices are caught up with public hearings right now. But good to see you, Karl. It's been too long.
Yes.
I don't know what it is. I always find myself extremely excited after you speak. You paint the picture of the world I'd like to live in. It may take us a while to get there. Part of my question has been answered. It's apparent that no state is really doing this yet in the fashion that you've described. What would it take for Connecticut, which is struggling to upgrade its grid, can't even get smart meters where they need to be, has a very high ratepayer cost as it is, to get to the point that you're talking about?
Actually, some states are leading. Nebraska, every public power entity in Nebraska, and it's all public power in Nebraska, have all committed to decarbonization goals. And we've shared this model with some of the big public power districts there. Hawaii, now even more than ever, realizes they're too addicted to oil and has been heading out this with using performance-based regulation as a platform for moving the way their utility system works, getting off of oil and even coal. So there are some good examples. What New York is trying to do is heading in this path. We've shared this, as Caitlin's going to say. So what do you need to do is first, I think, look hard at doing this roadmap. I do it for New England because you guys are interconnected as a group of states, as we know. And then focus the benefits of this fine resolution model to really see where things will happen. I will tell you where they probably will. Where people are bunched up, you want to put distributed resources. So you need to find ways to break this barrier to deploying community and rooftop that has been, I think, somewhat unfairly erected in the utility space. You guys in the legislature have got to demand an honest assessment of the benefits, of the value of distributed resources, and go after it whole hog. Don't stop doing what you're doing on offshore. Don't stop doing what you're doing on utility scale, but don't ignore the opportunity, the savings opportunity, because then you'll have a little money to play with in terms of savings. You can reduce those high rates that characterize Connecticut's electric rates, and you'll find smarter ways to build out the distribution infrastructure that makes up so much of a part of your utility rates in Connecticut today. So model it, map it, and do it.
Thank you, Carl. I think we have to start by explaining to my colleagues what DER even is.
We can do that.
All right. Maybe we'll enlist your help. Thank you very much, Peter, for
Okay.
letting me ask the question.
Thanks,
you, Jonathan.
Jonathan.